Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. Some stories begin in silence, but end as a scream of awareness. Picture this scene. An elderly man in a worn-out cap walks alone into a luxury restaurant. No one greets him. No one serves him. On the contrary, he hears whispers and sarcastic remarks. A waitress blurts out without shame, "These old men don't even leave tips." But what no one knew was that this man wasn't just a customer. He was the owner. And he was there, undercover, listening closely, especially to the words that should never have been said. When he stood up, left 1,000 rays on the table and a handwritten note that changed the course of the story, the truth hit like a shockwave. This isn't just a story about judgment. It's a living lesson about empathy, respect, and the price of underestimating someone. Because while some raise their voices to show power, others use silence to reveal who they truly are. And in this video, you'll see what happens when the one who seemed invisible decides to be seen. But let me warn you, after this, you might think twice before ignoring someone sitting right in front of you. He entered without making a scene. Faded cap, slow steps, simple clothes. Just another elderly man, right? But the moment he crossed that door, he became invisible. The waiters avoided eye contact. The dining room moved so fast that no one noticed the presence of someone who carried more than hunger. He carried a story on the verge of becoming a lesson. And those who judge by appearance lose the chance to see the truth. 15 minutes. That's how long silence spoke louder than any order. He didn't complain. He didn't raise his hand. He just waited. But what hurt wasn't the wait. It was the indifference disguised as professionalism. And then came the phrase like a dagger whispered in his ear. "These old men just take up space and don't even leave $5. A sentence that wasn't just prejudice. It was a snapshot of a culture that kills stories every day without realizing it. But the game was far from over. Because that seemingly fragile man wasn't just anybody, he was the owner. He had just purchased the restaurant in secret, precisely to uncover its flaws, and he found them right at the entrance. He didn't need to raise his voice. His strength was in the way he saw beyond the surface, and that's when many stories truly begin, when the ignored choose not to seek revenge, but transformation. No one noticed when he entered. A simple-looking man, calm eyes, slow steps. To the staff, he was just another lonely old man. Little did they know that this nobody was the new owner of the restaurant. He had bought the place quietly, drawn in by the promise of human-centered service. But it only took one morning to realize what they were selling as empathy was nothing but a facade. And that's where the stories that matter most truly begin, when the truth tears through the polish. His silence wasn't shyness, it was strategy. While they laughed behind his back, he took mental notes. Who served with disdain, who ignored customers, who treated respect as optional. He was the kind of person the world insists on overlooking, until it discovers who they really are. How many times have you dismissed someone just because they looked ordinary? Maybe, without knowing it, you disrespected the one person who could rewrite your entire story. And the most powerful part, he wore no badge, had no boss posture. But every one of his actions was a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it watches. Every whisper became a memory. Every judgmental glance, a mental note. Because he didn't want to humiliate anyone, he wanted to reveal truths. And right there, sitting like any other customer, he began a silent revolution. One of those stories that reminds us the invisible may actually be the most essential piece on the board. Sometimes, what hurts most isn't a direct insult. It's not a public confrontation or blatant disrespect. It's the whispered comment, the offhand remark, said as if no one's listening, but landing like a stone on the heart of the one who heard it. And that's exactly what happened that morning, in a restaurant that looked perfect on the outside but was rotting from within. A man, with serene eyes and simple clothes, quietly waited for his breakfast when he heard a waitress scoff, "These old men just take up tables and don't even leave $5. The sentence, though said casually, exposed the raw truth of that establishment's culture. She didn't know who he was, didn't care who might be listening. She simply voiced what many there likely thought, but didn't have the guts to say aloud. And that's the real danger, when prejudice becomes routine, when indifference is normalized. That waitress had no idea she had just given the most accurate diagnosis of the restaurant's problem, and she had done it in front of the owner himself. But he didn't react. He didn't rise, argue, or snap back. He just took a deep breath and stayed silent. And that silence, far from passive, was a calculated choice. Because some responses aren't meant to be instant. They need the right time, the right tone, the right setting. And he knew that. He knew he was facing a rare opportunity for transformation. That phrase, painful as it was the trigger. And great stories often start like that, with a decision made in calm, not in the heat of anger. Many businesses today showcase beautiful slogans on their walls. They talk about hospitality, warmth, and customer experience. But pay close attention to how the staff behaves, and you'll see the gap between the message and the reality. Service becomes robotic. Smiles become mechanical. The customer becomes a number. And the essence gets lost in the rush, the goals, and the silent judgments. That's why so many stories with great potential fall apart. They forget the most important part, the humanity behind each interaction. What happened that morning went far beyond a careless comment. It was a revelation. A thoughtless remark exposed an entire system poisoned by a mindset that devalues, labels, and judges people by what they seem to spend, not by who they truly are. And the most dangerous part? That mindset spreads like a virus. The waitress wasn't born prejudiced. She absorbed it from the environment, from the culture, from the lack of leadership. She was trained to serve plates, not people, taught to chase efficiency, not empathy. But the man who heard that comment wasn't just any customer. He was the owner. And in that moment, he understood that changing the menu, remodeling the space, or boosting marketing wouldn't be enough. The soul of the place needed rebuilding. Because places built only on appearances are fragile. They're castles made of sand. And he wanted something different. He wanted that restaurant to be remembered not for the luxury of its chairs, but for the dignity in the eyes of those who served. Not for the size of the bill, but for the size of the respect. It was time to change everything. And that change would begin in silence. His choice not to react right away was also a test. He wanted to observe more, to see how the other waiters behaved, how they treated different customers, the elderly, single mothers, people who weren't dressed to impress. And sadly, the pattern repeated. Comments disguised as jokes, impatient looks, selective service. It was as if, without noticing, the restaurant had turned into an exclusive club, where only those who seemed worth it were treated well. That's why so many stories become silent tragedies. Because no one notices the beginning of the fall. Disrespect settles in gradually, in the small things. The tone of voice, the rush, the lack of listening, the automatic judgment. And by the time someone realizes it, it's already too late. The best clients are gone. The good employees have quit. The reputation has become a buzz on social media. But in that restaurant, there was still time. Because someone had the courage to listen to what wasn't meant to be heard, and act on it. His silence was broken the next day, when he returned to the restaurant with a different presence, dressed as the businessman he truly was, yet still carrying that same calm look in his eyes. He wasn't seeking revenge, he was seeking awareness, and he brought with him something even more powerful than a reprimand, a decision, a proposal for transformation. Because great stories don't begin with punishment. They begin with the courage to build a new path, even if the old one was deeply disappointing. It's strange how a single careless phrase can plant the seed of a revolution. These old folks just take up space. She had no idea. But with that, she sentenced the end of an outdated culture. She sparked the beginning of a new era, where service would be more than delivery. It would be presence. Where customers would be seen as more than wallets. They'd be seen as people. And where employees would be more than task doers. They'd become the protagonists of real, human, and transformative stories. In the days that followed, he gathered the entire team. Not to shame, but to inspire. He showed them that every gesture, every word, every glance is a mirror. That what you say when you think no one is listening reveals more about who you are than 1,000 fake smiles. He implemented active listening training, held open dialogue circles, and encouraged honest feedback. More than that, he asked each employee to write a story they had experienced there, with customers, colleagues, or even alone. Because those who can't see others also can't truly see themselves. And that's how everything began to change. Not through magic, not by force, but by choice. The choice of a man who understood the power of words, who knew that silent gestures teach more than manuals, that every careless sentence can be either a warning or an invitation to change, and that the places that last, the businesses that become iconic, the brands that live on in memory, are those that respect stories. The ones that arrive, the ones that pass, and, most of all, the ones that are told in silence. The dining room was still a bit noisy when he finished his meal, glasses clinking in the background, hurried footsteps of waiters, scattered conversations around the tables. But at that particular table, time seemed to stop. The old man in the cap, now silent, stared at his empty plate. He didn't order dessert, didn't call the manager, didn't make a scene. He simply opened his worn leather wallet, took out 1,000 reais in folded bills, and calmly placed them under the plate. Beside it, he slid a small handwritten note in firm but elegant script. This was the most revealing meal of my life. Tomorrow, I return as the owner. There was no anger in that message, no sarcasm. Above all, it was a mirror, and anyone who read it carefully would realize that man wasn't just paying for the food. He was purchasing the awareness of everyone there. The waiter who whispered, the waitress who complained about the tip, the manager who ignored him, all of them were now facing something much bigger than a simple lunch. Because there, between the cash and the paper, one of the most powerful stories that restaurant had ever seen was born. That scene, which could have been forgotten like so many others marked by neglect and prejudice, was immortalized by a silent gesture, a note, a sentence, an unusual amount of money. But above all, a message that didn't need to be read aloud to cause an emotional earthquake in whoever received it. The waitress who picked up the plate nearly dropped everything, her eyes wide, breath caught, the note trembling in her hand, the bills perfectly folded, and suddenly everything made sense. Because sometimes there's no need to shout, slam the table, or call the media. Sometimes a single gesture is enough, a well-placed silence, a note that speaks louder than a lecture, and a tip that weighs more than a paycheck. That man didn't file a complaint. He didn't ask for a feedback form. He didn't deliver a moral sermon. He left something much harder to ignore, awareness. And awareness, once awakened, has the power to change everything. Maybe that's the true strength of the stories that teach. They don't point fingers. They don't accuse. They don't shame. They simply show. They provoke. And they transform. Like someone lighting a candle in a dark room and letting each person decide what to do with the light. The team in that moment was facing a choice. They could pretend nothing happened, blame it on exhaustion, the lunch rush, or the client's appearance, or for the first time they could truly look within. And that's exactly what began to happen. Slowly, as the note passed from hand to hand, the employees gathered, in silence. The once proud manager sat with the paper in her lap, staring at it as if trying to decode a mystery. But there was no mystery. The sentence was clear. Tomorrow I return as the owner. It was a promise of return. But more than that, it was an invitation to reflect. A signal that this place was about to turn the page. And as odd as it may seem, the money wasn't the focus. The 1,000 reais weren't left to show off. They were a symbol, a living metaphor for how much a single experience can be worth, not in monetary terms but in human value. As if the man were saying, you served me food, but you gave me something far more revealing, the truth about who you are when you think no one's watching. And that, believe me, is priceless. That story spread among the staff like wildfire, not because someone recorded a video, but because the memory of an authentic moment is more powerful than any marketing campaign. Days later, it was already part of the team's routine. It came up backstage in training and lunchtime conversations. It became a turning point, not by enforcement, but by revelation, because everyone finally understood that serving is about much more than just delivering a plate. That lesson applies to life. How many times do we miss opportunities to offer presence instead of product? How often do we deliver the bare minimum thinking it's enough, without realizing that what truly touches people isn't on the menu? A smile, a watchful eye, a respectful gesture. These are the true delicacies of the human experience. And when someone realizes this, the whole story changes direction. That direction, in fact, was already set. Because the note wasn't just a farewell, it was a seed. The next day, the man in the simple cap would return, but not as a customer. He'd return as the owner. And that changed everything. Not just in terms of hierarchy or authority, but of posture. He would be the mirror for that team, the constant reminder that anyone can be in charge, and that every ordinary face carries an extraordinary story waiting to be told if someone has the sensitivity to listen. And maybe that's the greatest silent revolution any place can undergo, when people stop treating others as just someone and start seeing in each person a possible story, a life worthy of respect, a customer who might be the owner, an employee who could be a leader, a gesture that could turn a whole business around, and it all begins with a simple note, a simple look, a simple thank you. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning when the manager asked for silence and gathered the team in the main hall. It was still early, but most of them already wore the tired expressions of a shift they expected to be just like any other. Arms crossed, stifled yawns, and that typical posture of people convinced nothing extraordinary would happen. It was Monday, and to them, that said it all. But the universe has a strange habit of turning routine into a plot twist when you least expect it. And it was precisely in that moment, when boredom seemed to take control of the scene, that the door opened, and then he walked in. But this time, he wasn't wearing the worn-out cap, nor the modest sweatshirt, nor the cloak of invisibility he wore the day before. Now he was a man in a dark, tailored suit, walking with purpose, carrying the posture of someone who knows exactly who he is, and more than that, someone about to change everything. The impact was almost physical. The air grew thick. Conversations ceased. It was as if time itself had paused for a second just to mark that moment. Those who had whispered, mocked, or ignored him now felt the full weight of their actions. The waitress who had complained about tips went pale. One of the servers stumbled while trying to hide his discomfort, but it was too late. There was no hiding from the truth that had just walked in wearing leather shoes and a determined expression. The old man from breakfast wasn't old, and he wasn't just any customer. He was the new owner, the man who, just the day before, had sat alone not to judge the taste of the food, but the human flavor of that place. And what he saw, unfortunately, was a menu full of arrogance, judgment, and indifference, a reality so bitter that not even the best coffee could mask it. But what he did next wasn't what many expected. He didn't pull out a list of terminations. He didn't shout. He didn't publicly humiliate anyone. On the contrary, he took a deep breath, looked each employee in the eyes, and with a firm yet calm voice, said something no one would ever forget. "I didn't come to punish. I came to transform." And right there, in that dramatic pause between fear and relief, a new story began. Perhaps the most important one that restaurant would ever experience. A story of turning points, of rebuilding, of humility. Because instead of responding with the same harshness he received, he chose the harder and nobler path, the path of empathy. He said he understood that the system was worn down, that many had been poorly trained, that the focus had been lost among quotas, rushes, and mechanical manuals, but that everything was about to change, and not just with words, with action, with commitment, with purpose. Right then and there, he announced a complete transformation program, a new cultural code, new training based on active listening, body language, and empathy, and more, a permanent recognition program where good service would no longer go unnoticed. It would be celebrated. Every human gesture would be highlighted. Every story of care or growth would become an example. He brought in renowned names to inspire the team, hospitality experts, coaches in empathetic leadership, authors of books like The Power of Listening and To Serve is to Lead. He made it clear that only those willing to grow would stay. That time on the job didn't matter. What mattered was the intention to serve from the heart, and that's when the magic began. For the first time, the employees didn't just feel pressured, they felt seen. Even those who had made mistakes were invited to start over with dignity, because he knew people change when they feel they can become better, not when they're afraid of being punished. And with that spirit, day after day, the restaurant became a laboratory for best practices. Meetings stopped being bureaucratic and became moments of listening. Each week, one employee was invited to share a story they'd experienced with a customer. Some were funny, others were moving, but all of them were real. And this process brought something that no traditional training had ever achieved: awareness. Awareness that behind every order, there's a human being, that a smile can change a day, that a sincere question can prevent a complaint, and that no one, absolutely no one, should ever be treated differently because of their appearance. The new owner knew that deeply. He had been underestimated himself. He'd heard things like, "He doesn't look successful," or "He doesn't fit this environment." That's why he made a point to reinforce. Every customer might be carrying a story, and if you're not paying attention, you might miss it. Or worse, You might be remembered as the bitterest chapter in it, and the team listened, but not like before. Now, they listened with their eyes, with their bodies, with their hearts, because they knew something big was happening. A culture shift, a silent revolution, built on simple yet consistent actions. Of course, not everyone stayed. Some chose to leave. They felt they weren't ready, and that was okay, because true change can't be forced. It's built with those willing to walk the path. But those who stayed, they grew, not just as professionals, but as human beings. Months later, that restaurant became a benchmark. It was featured in hospitality magazines. It became a case study at leadership events. But none of that was more important than the transformation that happened inside each person. Because the greatest stories aren't the ones in the headlines. They're the ones that change people from within. And it all started with a man who was ignored at breakfast and came back the next day not to take revenge, but to teach. Yes, he could have done what so many expected, or even feared. A single order and half the staff could have been dismissed on the spot. He had every justification: arrogance in service, lack of empathy, judgmental looks, unacceptable whispers in front of a client who, in the end, turned out to be none other than the restaurant's founder. The new owner, who had silently witnessed it all, could have acted with the cold logic of punishment and numbers, but he chose differently. He took a deep breath, lifted his gaze, and before the gathered team, said calmly and firmly, "I didn't come to punish. I came to transform." It was as if time froze. The tense faces of servers, managers, and hosts were overtaken by a mix of relief and confusion. They expected a scolding, maybe mass layoffs, but hearing that sentence shattered all their defenses. Because standing before them wasn't a leader driven by ego. It was someone who knew the value of stories and wanted to restore the dignity of this one. He didn't want to erase the shame. He wanted to turn it into awareness. And more than that, he wanted to plant a new culture. A culture of non-negotiable respect, of true empathy, of listening that goes beyond words. That's when he calmly and strategically announced a complete overhaul plan. No cosmetic changes, no superficial fixes. The transformation would begin from within, from the heart outward. The new cycle included bi-weekly training focused on active listening, workshops on emotional intelligence, exercises around unconscious bias, and most symbolically, the creation of a living mural filled with real customer stories. Anyone could leave a note, a thank you, a memory, or even a critique, and the team would study these notes as material for growth. The first meetings were intense. Some staff members cried when reading accounts from people who had felt invisible in the restaurant. Others tried to justify themselves, but the leader was clear. "I don't want guilt, I want awareness." He invited guest speakers with powerful life experiences, from a former homeless man who now teaches hospitality, to a psychologist who had lost her husband and explained how a simple "good morning" could change the course of grief. Each meeting was like stitching, mending what had been torn, strengthening what could still bloom. The restaurant's internal library was also redesigned. Books like "To Serve is to Lead," "The Power of Listening," and "Humanize to Delight" began circulating among staff. Anyone who wanted to read could. Anyone who wanted to apply what they learned would have the space. Moreover, they created small care circles, where employees would meet weekly to share real service situations, the good and the not so good. This became routine. And routine, when well cultivated, becomes culture. And that's how the major shift started to show. The once forced smiles grew warmer. The way menus were delivered changed. Now they came with attentive eyes, silent listening, and a genuine willingness to welcome. Small gestures, like pulling out a chair, noticing discomfort, or offering coffee before it was requested, multiplied. No one wanted to be remembered for judging someone like Alzira. Everyone now wanted to be remembered for learning from her. The restaurant began attracting not just customers but admirers. People traveled from afar just to experience the transformed environment. Corporate groups started using it as an example in hospitality training. The restaurant, once renowned for its menu's sophistication, was now also known for the sophistication of its care, and not because of marketing, but because of coherence. One of the greatest signs of this transformation came months later, when a young woman with visual impairment entered the dining room alone. She walked in uncertain until one of the waiters, the very same who used to mock different customers, approached her, gently offered his arm, softly described the room, and led her to a table by the window, saying, "There's a lovely light here. You can feel the warmth of the day, even if you can't see it." She smiled. So did he. And just like that, another story was born. Moments like these became more and more common. Customers who once felt overlooked now felt seen. Some returned just to say thank you. Others asked to leave notes on the mural. One of them wrote, "I was treated here like nowhere else. Not with urgency, but with presence." And that became the restaurant's new motto. Presence is the most important ingredient. The transformation ran so deep that even the staff began to change their life paths. One waiter chose to study psychology, inspired by the emotional training. A receptionist started a YouTube channel to share stories of kindness in customer service. The environment, once dominated by pressure and judgment, had become a place of awareness, empathy, and purpose. And the most curious part? It all began with a mistake. A collective mistake that could have led to punishment, but instead became the launch point for a revolution. Because in the end, that's what separates a boss from a leader. A boss imposes. A leader transforms. And only those who understand that every customer carries a story can build a company with a soul. But the biggest surprise, as I told you, was still to come. 1 year later, on the restaurant's founding anniversary, a quiet ceremony was held. Every employee received a letter, without knowing in advance, written by Alzira, the woman who had started it all. In it, she said, "I dreamed of a place where people would be nourished in the soul, not just the stomach. Thank you for continuing my dream, even without knowing who I was. Today, you don't just serve meals, you serve dignity, and that's what makes a story last." The letter was read aloud. Some cried, others embraced. And in that moment, everyone understood that sometimes the greatest transformations don't come from force, but from the conscious choice to look someone in the eye and say, "I didn't come to punish, I came to transform." And how lucky we are when a single sentence becomes the beginning of a new story. In the middle of a rainy morning, the meeting room was filled with tension. The changes had been announced. New rules, new leadership, higher expectations. Many were restless, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what would happen to their roles, their routines. The once informal environment now breathed uncertainty. The presence of the new restaurant owner, a businessman known for high standards, only thickened the air. But right in the middle of that heavy scene, something unexpected happened. A hand rose, hesitantly, not a manager's, not someone who usually spoke at meetings. It was Jonas, the restaurant's oldest waiter, a quiet man, always in his corner, doing his job in silence. Few remembered him at staff parties. Almost no one knew his story. But in that moment, every eye turned to him. There was something in his gaze, a mix of respect, firmness, and memory. With a calm but powerful voice, Jonas looked into the eyes of the new owner and said, "I knew that gentleman was special. That's why I served him with respect." The words echoed through the room like a beam of light cutting through heavy clouds. Tension gave way to reflection. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was reverent, because this wasn't just a sentence. It was a stance, a story. Jonas had written through his actions even when no one was watching. The owner, visibly moved, stood up slowly, walked over to Jonas without a word, extended his hand and shaking it said clearly, "True leadership doesn't come from a title, it comes from character." Right there in front of everyone he promoted Jonas, from quiet waiter to head of service. Not for flattery, not for seniority, but for integrity. Because to lead at its core is to be an example before being an authority. It's seeing what no one else sees and acting as if everyone's watching, even when no one is. That promotion wasn't just symbolic. It was a turning point, a quiet but powerful milestone. The other staff members, once apathetic or anxious, began to see Jonas differently, not just as the old veteran in the corner, but as someone with something to teach. And more than that, they began reflecting on their own behavior. They questioned how many times they had ignored customers, how often they served on autopilot without presence, without soul. Inspired by him, many began to change small habits. The smile was no longer mechanical. The good morning became more sincere. The rush gave way to attentiveness, and little by little, like a domino effect, the restaurant started to change from the inside out, not through imposed rules, but through the contagion of values. It was as if Jonas's quiet story had awakened sleeping consciences. The most beautiful part? Jonas never sought recognition. For him, serving well had always been a personal value, not a career strategy. He believed every customer carried a story, even if they said nothing, that every person at the table deserved eye contact, even if they only ordered coffee, and maybe that's what set him apart. He never waited for the customer to prove who they were. He gave respect by principle, not by resume. This story became an example not only among the staff but also within leadership. The new owner himself began leading meetings with a different tone. He spoke less about goals and more about purpose. He showed real-life videos, shared testimonials from customers who had felt either welcomed or ignored, and emphasized the importance of being present during service. The company's culture began to shift, not with empty slogans but with living stories. And that was exactly what caught the attention of the local press. A reporter, upon hearing about the cultural turnaround of the restaurant, wanted to understand where the change had started. He expected to find a manual, a methodology, maybe a consultant. But when he spoke to the employees, they all pointed in the same direction. It started with Jonas. The article ran in the newspaper under the headline, "The Revolution That Began with a Gesture." And there he was, on the front page, wearing his simple uniform, but with eyes full of pride, not because of his new title, but because his quiet stance had finally found an echo. Over time, other branches of the chain adopted the same model of inspirational leadership based on real examples. Meetings began to include space for sharing, stories of resilience, respect, and transformation experienced during the day. The main headquarters put up a mural that displayed not just Employee of the Month awards, but also powerful quotes from clients or staff. One of them was Jonas's. "Serve with respect even when no one is watching. You might be in front of someone who will change your life." Today, years after that episode, Jonas is still at the restaurant, now as a mentor to new servers. He doesn't give formal classes, nor does he use slides. He prefers eye contact, hallway conversations, real-time guidance during shifts, and with each news story born there, he smiles like someone sowing seeds in fertile ground, because he knows that when you serve with your heart, the stories take care of the rest. That's why this story must be told, because it reminds us that the greatest leaders are not the loudest, but those who listen the deepest. That respect should not be a reaction to someone's status, but a choice made in the face of our shared humanity, and that the most lasting transformations often begin like this, with a simple gesture, a true presence, a look that sees beyond the name tag. Months had passed since that episode, which at first glance seemed like just another quiet morning in a corner restaurant, but it wasn't. The timid entrance of a white-haired lady and the spontaneous kindness of a young waiter became the turning point of an entire culture. What was once a sophisticated environment guided by cold protocols began to acquire something that can't be bought or taught in quick seminars: truth. The restaurant, once known for its aesthetic elegance, was now remembered for its elegance of soul, the kind that manifests in a look, a tone of voice, a gesture that listens before it serves. The comments started discreetly, almost like whispers among regulars, but soon they became a chorus. "Here, we are seen, not just served." That small compliment became a guiding light for everything that came next. The training changed. It began to include active listening, practical empathy, and even silence exercises so servers could learn to perceive the unspoken. But what changed the most was the awareness. It was no longer about good service for the sake of a tip. It was about belonging to something greater, an ecosystem where every customer, no matter how quiet or moody, carried a story. And if every person was a story, then every gesture had the power to turn a page, to close old chapters or open new beginnings. That's when the idea of the wall of people came up, an entire wall dedicated to recording the small, great stories that happened among the hallways, the tables, the backstage. These weren't heroic feats. They were tiny acts that, in that space, gained the weight of a revolution. The waiter who held the hand of a widow moved by a memory. The kitchen assistant who made a lactose-free dish just because she saw the client nervously reading food labels. The security guard who held an umbrella over a child. These stories began to be shared in post-shift circles, in monthly meetings, and eventually turned into lectures, hospitality event invitations, and features in industry magazines. But the most beautiful part of this transformation wasn't the external success. It was the internal pride. Employees who once saw their job as just a paycheck started to see purpose in what they did. They felt they were writing stories every day, and that somehow this made them authors of change. With every new hire, an emotional onboarding took place. It became mandatory to hear the story of the man in the cap, of the forgotten founder, of the waiter promoted for the simplest gesture, and everyone, without exception, was asked the same question. If the customer at your table were your father, would you serve them differently? Most people stayed silent, but they left transformed. At the entrance of the restaurant, right next to the board of monthly reviews, there was a phrase written in golden letters: "Serve with your heart." It might be the owner in front of you, and that wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. A daily reminder that appearances deceive, that silence is not emptiness, and that humility may carry the most powerful stories. The whole team knew. It wasn't just about food, it was about presence, about being there, body, mind, and soul. Because when someone sits at the table, they don't just bring hunger, they bring memories, urgency, longing, insecurities, expectations, and above all, humanity. Curiously, even the customers changed. They began to visit not just for the quality of the food, but for the quality of the emotional atmosphere. There was a sense of respect that wasn't enforced. It was contagious. Families came back with their kids to show them what real service is. Couples celebrated anniversaries there because they knew they would be cared for. Solitary folks came looking for more than a warm meal. They came seeking to be heard. And they left with something hard to name, but easy to feel: warmth. Some stories became internal legends, like the one about an executive who, after being kindly served by a young waitress, returned days later with his entire team and hired the restaurant to train the staff in his hotel chain. Or the elderly lady who brought flowers every Friday to give to whoever treated her kindly, as a way of repaying the gesture that had touched her months before. The wheel kept turning, and every act of respect sparked another. The restaurant's culture became an invisible chain of humanization. Even conflicts were redefined. When someone was rude or impatient, the staff didn't react with coldness. They tried to understand. They had learned that often, behind rudeness, there's pain, and that responding with presence, not pride, was the most powerful way to turn that moment into something memorable. And so, more stories were born, every day, among dishes, silverware, and glances that finally met. At the end of each shift, a practice was introduced: the memory moment. Each employee could share a story from the day, something that touched them, taught them, or surprised them. It became a space for listening, sharing, and collective growth. Some laughed, others cried, but everyone left more aware that they were part of something greater, not just a restaurant, but a movement, a silent manifesto against indifference and automation, a daily reminder that serving is a revolutionary act, when done with soul. And you know what's most inspiring? This change didn't require million-dollar investments. It didn't come from expensive consultants or superficial rebranding. It started with a gesture, a single gesture, from a young man who cleaned a chair, without knowing who the woman was, without expecting anything in return, simply out of respect. And that gesture reignited the essence of an entire place. Because transformative stories rarely begin with speeches, they begin with actions. And now I ask you, how have you been treating the stories that cross your path? Would you recognize a disguised owner? Or are you still judging people by their cap, their age, or their silence? Because in the end, what transforms environments isn't renovation, it's attitude. And every gesture you make today might be writing the decisive chapter of your story, or staining what could have been the greatest turning point of your life. How many stories have passed by you today, without you even noticing? Maybe it was that quiet old man at the bakery, the distracted woman at the checkout, or even that customer who seemed too demanding, but deep down just wanted to be treated with kindness. The truth is, we're surrounded by stories, yet we insist on seeing them only as people. We reduce entire biographies to appearances, job titles, gestures, or clothing, and in doing so, we lose what's most valuable: the chance to understand others in their fullness. This text is more than a reflection. It's an invitation to see beyond the surface. Because while you read this, someone out there is being underestimated, judged, ignored. And you can bet, many times that person carries a story of immeasurable worth that could transform an entire environment, if only it were heard. The problem is that we confuse silence with irrelevance, simplicity with unimportance, and humility with weakness. And here comes the question that truly matters. How have you been treating the stories that cross your path? Have you welcomed them or merely tolerated them? Have you really listened or just waited for your turn to speak? Have you looked into people's eyes or just walked past in a hurry? It may seem like an exaggeration, but it's in these small gestures that a culture is formed, whether it's in a restaurant, a company, a family, or even a YouTube channel. Because in the end, spaces don't change with new furniture or updated service policies. They change through actions. They change when someone decides to treat others with dignity, even when no one is watching. When someone understands that serving is more than delivering an order, it's delivering presence. And that's when a new story is born, the kind no one forgets. Have you ever asked yourself how you'd react if you found out that quiet customer in the worn-out cap was actually the owner of the company? Or that the white-haired woman sitting quietly in the corner was the founder of the very place you work at? These aren't made-up scenes, they're living metaphors for what happens every single day, and within them lie the greatest lessons. The problem is that we're addicted to masks. We want to know the title, the salary, the status before deciding how to treat someone, as if respect were something negotiable, conditioned by the other person's prestige. But it's not. Respect is the starting point, not the reward. And as long as we don't understand that, we'll keep falling into the same traps, treating well those who look important and ignoring those who have nothing to offer. But life, my friend, loves plot twists. And the biggest ones flip the table when no one sees them coming. That's why every gesture matters. Every choice is a line written in a larger story, and you never know when you're being observed, when that invisible customer might actually be the key to your future. What seems irrelevant today could be, tomorrow, the most talked about chapter of your journey. So I ask you again, what will you do differently from now on? Will you keep ignoring those who don't stand out? Will you keep treating others based on what they can give you? Or will you begin to serve from the heart, even without applause, even without immediate recognition? Because serving with love is not submission, it's leadership. Leadership rooted in values, in example, in awareness. This video, this story, is not just a touching narrative, it's a mirror. And like all mirrors, it demands courage. Courage to face your own habits. Courage to admit where you've been wrong. Courage to change. Because real change begins when we choose to see differently what has always been there, but was never truly seen. And if this content touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Send it to that friend who's always in a rush, to that coworker who needs to relearn how to listen, to someone you know who judges too much and understands too little. Because great stories need to circulate. They need to echo. They need to shake certainties. And above all, they need to awaken awareness. Respect doesn't wear a badge. It shows up in presence, in empathy, in intention. And you don't need a fancy title to transform a place. You just need awareness. That's what changes how we serve, how we listen, how we see others. That's what decides whether your story will be remembered as a bridge or a barrier. So if you believe in the power of the stories, if you believe that a well-told narrative can change a mindset, a habit, a company, or even a destiny, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Because here, we don't just tell stories to touch people, we tell them to wake people up, to transform, to make you think differently and act more humanely. Remember, it's not about going viral, it's about creating impact. And if a single sentence made you pause and reflect, then it was worth it. Because the world doesn't need more scripted speeches. It needs more people willing to live with coherence. And every awakened person awakens others. That's how great stories are born. In the details, in the silence, in the gesture, and who knows, maybe someday someone will tell your story as the example of someone who saw first, who respected first, who transformed everything, including their own destiny.